Hello, and welcome back to the Green Heart Wellbeing Podcast. So, the last couple of episodes, I've done pretty well in my world, and I want to kind of continue on this theme of really getting into wellbeing and education and then what that looks like. And again, like always, I'll mention a few things about Green Heart. So, this episode, why wellbeing initiatives fail in school. Now, I always want to be really clear when I start these episodes. I am pro-school, I am pro-learning, I'm pro-education, and I'm pro-wellbeing. So these episodes are never about bashing what anybody's done or anything like that. And it's never a criticism. It's always a conversation, reflection, and that's how things improve. So it's actually really nice to be part of the discourse around all that. So when the last few episodes, when I think about it, they're really going into the systems and the depth and looking at what's there and then thinking about how we can improve it. And of course, that's where I consider Green Heart to be able to come in and, be part of that, Green Heart Wellbeing, to do some supportive things around that. So schools don't fail at wellbeing because they don't care. There can be failures along the line because they underestimate what it actually requires. And I've experienced this as well. I've seen it in different schools that I've visited. And I also recognise lots of the things as things that I've done, as part of my journey when trying to implement wellbeing within education. So, yeah, I just want to have a kind of reflection and a chat about some of the main points that come around it. And also, I'm always looking on LinkedIn and social media and seeing what schools are sharing that they're doing around wellbeing. There's so much lovely stuff. But again, I want to kind of celebrate that, but also move away from the kind of top level of things and get a bit deeper into the granular support. Because my whole thing, and I was on a podcast this morning talking about this, is why my hair actually looks like I've done something with it for once if you're watching on YouTube. So I thought I might as well record an episode of my own while I'm at it. But we were talking about I don't know, I forgot what I was going to say because I'm talking about my hair. I had to pause that and check and come back. My whole thing is preventative well-being. And that's the point that I really wanted to make was everybody can benefit from systemic well-being education. It's not just when things go wrong. And one of the questions this morning was about what can someone do if they're feeling unhappy, or how can we support kids? And I'm like, it's giving them tools, learning about the support of psychological tools that we can use. And a lot of that is in positive psychology, but it's using or teaching about them so that when the stuff does happen, they're a bit better prepared. I definitely wasn't prepared for things that happened in my life because we didn't learn about this stuff. Anyway, that was the point that I wanted to make. So some different points. There's 5 main points in this episode. The first one, and I've definitely talked about this before, one of the things that kind of schools will stumble, or it becomes a stumbling block, is when well-being is an add-on, and we've all talked about that. And again, it's never intentional. We all want to do better at this stuff, but there's hardly any time. There's so many new things that need to be implemented all the time. Even this year alone, the amount of schools who'll be focusing on adaptations of tech curriculum and day-to-day curriculum when it comes to AI and ChatGPT and what e-safety looks like. So there's always priorities. But again, when I'm talking, I'm always talking about what my priority is. But again, I think it touches every aspect of school. So when it's not an infrastructure, that's when I think it becomes, and I actually don't like this word failure. That was a clickbait title for the episode, but it's maybe more of a stumbling block when we have a one-off well-being week or a one-off written policy that no one ever kind of refers to again, or it's a poster in the toilet. The amount of schools that I've been in, and when you go to the washroom, there's a wee poster stuck on the back of the door, and it's a great reminder at the time, but I think when you've got 800 other things floating about your head, if you're on the way to the printer or whatever, it's hard to really take it in. I have been part of wellbeing committees across school cross one, community cross ones, people from different schools, people within schools, you know, and again, it's the time around that. It becomes hard. So if there is a committee formed, but then there isn't actually action happening, then that's when it becomes like a kind of add-on that gets mentioned, but it's hard to then evidence the infrastructure. So really, the point I wanted to make here is when we're looking at well-being, again, it's like really embedding it through leadership behaviour, decision-making. And I'd say subconsciously we do a lot of that around the child, like when we're in school, you know, when you think about trips and risk assessment and lessons, and kids are always at the core of that, you know, or the learners are always at the core of that. But when you've got something to refer to, for example, like the policy or the strategy that the committee have come up with or whatever it is, then the decision making becomes more informed around the lens of well-being. But again, there's stuff like timetabling and workload structures. This never will work if it's just going to be balanced on top of everything else that staff are already managing. There's this episode of The Simpsons, and I often always think about that. It's like, rather than take the big trash can out, Homer Simpson is like balancing one more piece of trash on top of the other. It's like, well, something's got to give, you know. So I think it's, you know, with all the long form AI platforms that are available, there are ways that can really help us work smarter, not harder. So when I think again back to positive psychology, well-being is systemic, you know, and there are frameworks within it, such as PERMA, which I could do a whole episode on. And it can't thrive in environments that are where there's, you know, misalignment, not just around values. Like schools often have their own values. But again, when there isn't actually space and time to embed those frameworks properly. So, you know, we've all been at CPD when it's like a one-off workshop. I still do one-off workshops in schools, like, because sometimes that's all the budget or the time makes space for. But we can't continue to like workshop our way out of the need for structural well-being. So that's definitely something that I wanted to kind of talk about in the first point. We know that those workshops can be useful in thinking reflective points. We might reflect on it briefly, but then it disappears into the ether of all the other things. So yeah, this is what I talked about a lot in the last episode. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, please do. Or maybe it was one before, I can't remember. But it's thinking about confusing awareness with application. So one of my recent Green Heart Wellbeing newsletters talked about sometimes awareness just isn't enough. It's great to know it's there, it's great to have it, but then it's the step beyond that. So I would say almost everyone I speak to within education now knows the language, can talk about one or two maybe like prominent research headlines. A really big one I think was from the BBC talking about teacher well-being and how it's impacting retention. You know, teachers are leaving in high numbers with industry. So I'm like, okay, well, that's a headline that most of us can quote. And schools will talk about things that are confidence building and, you know, building resilience and improving mindset. And yeah, these might all be conversations or, you know, circle time or pastoral lesson that happen within the school. We know what those words mean, but then there's also, like everything, there's always another more research informed level underneath that, which can also be received by the children, you know, if it's taught in the right way. So applied coaching psychology tells us that insight does not equate to behavioural change. So this is where I've often stumbled personally. You know, it's like I know certain things, but my issue might then be the habit change, the behavioural change, the implementing the action, you know, and that can be in anything in life. So when you think about what does change actually require, so again, if you were thinking about in your workplace, your organisation or school, if you were really embedding change for staff well-being or student well-being, it's got to be modelling, there's got to be consistency, there's got to be repetition at times, reinforcement, And the biggest one, which I talk about a lot in my research, and I always reference this because it just seems is still important, psychological safety. So, it's one of those things that, like, things don't change unless we, make the effort to do it. We elbow out the stuff that maybe isn't working, and we start to take calculated or safe risks around that, and see what works. And then eventually we get to the practice that is really effective. So, for example, like, I know about nervous systems, but knowing about it doesn't regulate them. So I'm actually going into a school to do a little morning with the foundation stage 2, and it's all about self-regulation. So I know that, like, they know about their feelings, and I can talk about the phrase regulation, but what they're going to need is, like, in the moment practicing in a fun, engaged way, so that then they can actually begin to regulate themselves. And this will need to be reinforced and repeated by the teachers, modeled by the teachers consistently, and also the parents, if that was going to make a real impact for the children. So I think that's where I come into when I'm thinking about the awareness and the application. So maybe touching back on another episode. Another thing that maybe where schools stumble when they're trying to apply well-being or do well-being is the actual emotional labour of this work is ignored. I've spoke about how it's often a bolt-on or added to someone else's already role, or a leader might have well-being under their umbrella of subjects that they look at. There might be a well-being person through school that's out of class, so they've got a bit more time. But again, I've talked about how, it's not soft skills, like there's nothing soft about this work. So when you think about, like, teachers, right, and in the classroom, or even apply this to your own context, but when you think about what an educator is, they're emotional regulators, conflict resolution. They are attachment figures for the children, particularly the younger years. In a sense, performers, and I've got another story one time about somebody during an observation telling me I wasn't animated enough, and I had a real problem with that, because I'm like, I'm not a child performer. My strength is my calm, like, approach. So, like, some people they're so good at being the performer and the teacher that really engages children. But even when you think about personally, if you're not feeling great and you go into the classroom, you slap that face on of, like, hi, welcome. It doesn't matter what's going on in your real life. You perform to the best of your ability to make sure the children have a great day of learning. They're data analysts. I've got friends just now who'll talk about all the data that has to be in, and, how they analyse it, how that informs next steps. Like, so when you think about all the different things that go on, so that is like emotional labour, or that is brain labour within the workplace. But when you think about when it comes to well-being, there's all of that stuff, but it's coming to the student well-being, the parent involvement, the visibility, and that's a lot in itself because of the nature of the work. What you're carrying there is a bit different from, like the skills and objectives that are being covered in the day-to-day curriculum. So what have I written here about? Staff emotional load. I actually find teaching a very emotional career anyway, because it's relational. It's all about the relationships that you have. And often I've written here boundary erosion. So, like, particularly during COVID time, all the boundaries were like all over the place because schools moved online immediately, and then it was like calls at 10 o'clock at night, like, how are we going to get this going for tomorrow, and so there is a cognitive overload. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is the emotional labour of implementing well-being work well within an educational community or a workplace organisation. And I always say this, if adults are dysregulated, that impacts the regulation of the kids. So you never start with student well-being when you're implementing this kind of stuff. You start with the adults. And when I go into schools and offer my Green Heart Wellbeing curriculum and I talk about this, the staff training comes first on the modules and the themes. Then the implementation for the children comes next. And that's often after a period of time that the adults have had time to sit with, learn, go through the motions of embedding that experience into, their day-to-day life. So yeah, I think there's something about making space for training for staff before it comes to the children. And maybe, like I say, that's where a stumbling block can happen, because we're always thinking about the student well-being. Let's plan this day for them. Let's bring in a speaker for mental health day. Let's provide, and then cookies in the staff room for the staff on that day, which I've also done, by the way. But I hope that's kind of clear what the point is that I'm trying to get to there. Now, this one is a bit like tricky in a sense. So it's leadership buy-in, okay? And I've never met a leader ever in my whole education career where they haven't, wanted to support new initiatives, but particularly well-being throughout the school. But it's different when schools are businesses, because, and this is the same in other places where it's like local authorities and there's budgets and stuff like that. But there's a discomfort in turning inward and looking at your own being through this lens. So ideally, if I was going to support schools with wellbeing, the initial workshops and conversations happen with the leaders and the decision makers. There's no point in me trying to implement a curriculum for the children when it comes to wellbeing if the leaders don't understand or aren't present for the language, aren't 100% clear on the strategy and the plan. Do you know what I mean? So, but then also part of that, like I said before, when I do training for the staff before it comes to the children, part of that includes like emotions and character strengths and, mindfulness. And some people might hear that word mindfulness and be like, which I get, it's not for everybody, but it's also going through the discomfort of learning about it and what it feels like and how difficult it can be, because for some people it will work, and then having a knowledge and a lived experience of that can only benefit the people within the team and then by proxy the children. Another tricky thing, I think, for the discomfort that comes around it when it comes to leadership can be the modelling the vulnerability. Leaders hold so much. They have difficult conversations with people, performance reviews, also within expat communities, life outside school can pour into school a little bit more, because wherever there are humans, there is messy human stuff. And sometimes someone will have something really difficult going on in their life and they have to share it with the leaders. The same way that leaders would celebrate the really positive things that happen in people's lives, So sometimes I believe, and I've written this in one of my Emo Beans children's books, I think it's the character strength one, real leaders lead from the soul. There's that real openness and the ability to be vulnerable at times, Also, leaders have, on the flip side of that, there's boundaries. You can't then be a leader and oh God, I don't know, I suppose an example I'm thinking of, if someone's coming in and they're roaring and crying and then you end up roaring and crying too, nobody's helping anybody, So, I mean, that's a very extreme example, but I think it's important then about leaderships do have to find that fine balance between vulnerability and holding boundaries, and that can also be uncomfortable when you think about that. Someone that you really respect and admire and know for really well, but then there's there comes boundaries. You might have to have a difficult conversation with them. So anyway, when I'm coming back all the way around to well-being here, I think it's like I've been to workshops and stuff like that when it's about staff well-being, and management haven't been there, and this can be online as well. It's like they set it up for the staff, they have you in, but then they go off and carry on doing things. So I'm a bit like, well, that, again, is like an implicit message of what does that mean? So I'll let you think about that. So anyway, the initiatives might stumble because they require psychological work at a leadership level, and that can be uncomfortable. I know that many organisations use like the personality, the 360 things, the Gallup strengths, all the Clifton strengths, all the different things, and it's so useful. And I think I've talked about how I've heard within organisations how the colours like red, yellow, blue and green, like the different personalities, are on the computers, so people know how to approach conversations, which is really nice. But I think what I'm looking at is more the layer beneath that, like the human part of like what makes that part of your personality and how can that flourish within your environment. And to me, that's where positive psychology and coaching psychology can come in. So again, like I say at the beginning of all the episodes, it's like not a criticism or anything, but there is an element of leadership buy-in matters. Decision makers should be there. All stakeholders should be involved in the implementation of well-being. And that means like the admin staff and, site workers and just all the things, so that everyone's kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. So the last point I wanted to kind of chat about is I've written like the measurement. I always get asked, how are we going to measure this? How are we going to improve this to the inspectors that it works? And I struggle with it. I get it. I understand why there's got to be certain things like that within schools. But my answer is always like, speak to someone, like look to someone eye to eye and get them to tell you about their experience, how they feel. Do they feel safe? What happens if something goes wrong? Who do they talk to? If it's mindfulness or whatever, and it's a little child, you'd be like, what does mindfulness mean to you? And tell me. There's like a real qualitative aspect of data capture around that. So schools will measure like engagement week, participation. There will be surveys. I still would send surveys out, particularly when it comes to strengths work. There's feedback forms, there's attendance taken at CPD, things like that. I would be interested to know how many schools have brought in someone to chat about, say, psychological safety. And I know that happens, which is amazing. I have some colleagues that go and do psychological first aid, mental health first aid courses, which is brilliant. So then again, it's like that stuff in action, that stuff working within the system, within the organisation, and really being a psychologically safe, net to catch the things, the people that are heading towards it, So yeah, I feel like that's probably one of the ones that is most frequently introduced into staffs. But then I also think about beyond that, what about autonomy? Sometimes I find there can lack autonomy within certain curriculums because the objectives are so black and white. And although you have freedom to create lessons and stuff around that, it's the time again, especially some schools in Dubai where I am, they've got 9 and 10 and 11 classes within one year group. So the teachers all plan for the subjects together. And, because there's only so much time, so you can't often fit in creative different things for every lesson, so it's yes, the lessons in themselves will be creative and well thought out and well resourced, but because you don't have time within you to do it for all the subjects, you're planning for say one. So yeah, I think, and then beyond that, autonomy within leadership, how many hours are allocated to the management of the current systems, and then how many are allocated to leading from the soul, rolling your sleeves up and being in the middle of it all. So it's just such a hard balance for leaders as well, and staff and teachers. But also if you think in other industries, it's the autonomy is important. So yeah, when we're thinking about measurement and coming back to that, we've got the surveys, we've got the student wellbeing surveys and things like that. But how are we data grabbing for the staff cognitive load, long-term behaviour shifts, longitudinal studies, psychological safety, and feelings of autonomy, and then that means that well-being is like a kind of narrative, it's like the thing I'm trying to get at is the practice day to day, and reflecting in the ecosystem of the school. Like, are people feeling burnt out, or is there actionable things to do when people are feeling like they're struggling? Or so it's just, again, it's the same. I think everything I'm saying is the same thing. It's like there's the awareness and then there's the action. So anyway, these are just some of my thoughts around that. If you're a school leader and you're listening, or you're a teacher and you're listening, or you're working in a different organisation and you have an interest in improving wellbeing provision, it's like, where within, if you think about decision making, where are you on that? Are you so far from any decision making you can't even see it? Or are you a decision maker? And think about that in relation to wellbeing. What does that look like for you? Who carries the emotional load in your school? Is it all staff and leaders? Like, are you just carrying so much stuff? Or is it just like the counsellor? Are they the only person? So that's what I mean when you think about, if someone is trying to implement wellbeing strategies even, and there's a wellbeing leader, say, are they supported in it? Do they have autonomy in it? Or can they not move much because they have other things that they need to be focusing on? So and then another point, when we've got the initiatives and awareness days and things like that, is there integration? Or is it just like a knee-jerk reaction to, like, oh, it's Mental Health Day on the 10th, what should we do for the community there? Which again is lovely, and it's useful, but I think, and even for myself, my whole thought process is really shifting to, like, okay, so what's after that then? And then is well-being discussed when budgets are allocated? I know that in Dubai a lot of the budgets are kind of finished now for the next academic year. And there's so many schools that do have a wellbeing budget, but then it's like some don't. So is wellbeing even discussed? And when it's discussed, is it like initiatives? Is it one-off events that it covers? Or is it sending someone on training that's going to help implement wellbeing throughout the whole community? Or is it bringing in an expert or a company like Green Heart Wellbeing? Shameless plug. But it's something worth thinking about, So anyway, if you're listening and you're realising that this wellbeing work could feel a little fragmented or on the surface, which is fine if it is, but this is exactly where I would come and do work with schools. So Green Heart, yes, I can do workshops, like of course I can, but I really flourish myself and love to be part of applied psychological well-being strategies, and that's where the positive psychology work comes in for the staff, but also for the children, because then the whole curriculum is written with positive psychology interventions in mind. So I work with leadership teams to move well-being from intentional to more of a infrastructure, or I'll prefer the word ecosystem. So please get in touch with me. I'm loving that each time I check the analytics for the episodes, there's a few more views and a couple more engagements. I definitely get messages after each episode on different platforms, so that's lovely. I can come and consult when it comes to wellbeing. I can come and do work within corporate organisations when it comes to wellbeing. I can help with strategy sessions. I can help with curriculum implementation. And on the podcast today, they were really lovely because they said, bring all your resources and books for the kids. And they were sitting on the table. So when I think about that, I'm like, there's the whole funnel aspect of like this wide decade that I've been immersing myself, like the geek of all geeks, in positive psychology and wellbeing and education. And then when I've seen all my resources and little emo beans and books like sitting on the table, and like I said, I'm doing a foundation stage self-regulation morning, I'm like, that to me is the funnel of how it impacts the children. So there's all this big stuff happening. It happens at the organizational level. It immerses itself in the system, and then you're sitting with a little child and helping them develop emotional literacy through little beans. So anyway, thank you so much for listening. This is a bit longer. I think they're getting longer and longer each week, but anyway, get in touch with me, and thanks for listening.